Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. I'm Philip Ideson. I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement, and I'm delighted to share the stage right now with my co-founder at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely, Phil, not a problem.
Now, if this is the first AOP Live that you have joined, this is all about questions. We have one slide to show right at the beginning, which is around a poll question. But apart from that, we do just really invite you to ask questions throughout the conversation. You can do that just by, you'll see the chat. There's actually a chat and a Q&A section in the sidebar on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll be keeping an eye on both, but feel free to pop something in the chat. Feel free to pop something in that Q&A box. And then as we can introduce that into today's conversation, we will do that. And now today's topic is something that I'm certainly really interested in, and that's the topic of supply risk. You know, supply risk really is everywhere, and it takes many different forms, from regulatory risk, supply chain disruption, data privacy. We've got ESG-related risks to worry about now. So it's not just about one single thing, lots of different kind of components to risk. You know, I've certainly observed over the last 6 to 12 months that risk is becoming even more important for procurement professionals. And so everything that we're kind of doing is fitting through this risk lens. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how we integrate risk management with other processes. Title being when third-party risk is a first-tier priority. And we're going to be joined by Jag Lamba. Jag is the CEO of Certa. And we're going to be just facilitating this a little bit differently, aren't we, Kelly, compared to how we would do our typical AOP Live.
We are, just to make sure I get more of a turn to talk this time. Mm-hmm. Usually we're battling back and forth for the moderator's hat. In a minute here, we're going to swap over, and I'm going to be in the moderator seat, facilitating a conversation, not just with you, Phil and Jag, but with the audience as well.
Yeah. And Jag, welcome to our AOP Live today.
Hi, Jag.
Thanks for having me.
And now I always start with the same question. And I know that, you know, a lot of our guests come from different backgrounds, but I think it's interesting and kind of contextual for the conversation. And that's, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
I found procurement. So while I was a consultant at McKinsey, I saw how hard it was for companies to work with each other across their borders. And, you know, being an engineer by training, I felt like this is a problem I can solve. And I saw so many, you know, so many incredible firms that we were serving really get stuck and, you know, with this one problem. And that's how I decided that, okay, this is a problem that I think I can have a reasonably big impact in overall business economy. I also felt like actually I can have a positive impact on the world by solving this problem, but happy to go into that a little bit more later.
No, we'll definitely dig into that as we go through the conversation. And it's one of those areas as well where I felt, and we'll talk about this again later, third-party risk management is something that, you know, is just increasingly important for procurement, for procurement to be involved in. But it's something that we still, I think, have difficulty in figuring out. How do we build programs, platforms? How do we scale it? So excited to talk about that a little bit. Now, you talked about your background in software engineering strategy. How do you think that that kind of shaped your perspective on this topic of risk?
You know, in terms of the engineering, I felt that there was need for a solution that was comprehensive but personalizable. So you know, what I found companies struggle with is multiple point solutions for each aspect of risk, compliance, and ESG. And I saw companies struggle kind of stitch these together, you know, in addition to their P2P suites. And, you know, that's how, you know, I being an engineer, I think in terms of operating systems.
Yeah.
So I thought what was needed here is an operating system for companies to work with third parties that was comprehensive and personalizable. Just in terms of strategy, what I was saying is that I felt that, you know, the friction is actually the friction in like how companies work with each other is actually slowing down, and it's a drag on the global economy. And I felt that that's a worthwhile problem to solve. You know, in addition to, of course, helping firms share their goodness and their, in terms of their ESG policies, their, corporate social responsibility policies, across with their suppliers also. So it kind of felt like it was a good way for companies to spread their goodness across their borders, beyond their borders.
And so, Kelly, I think we have, we did a poll as we came into this webinar. I wonder if you could share that, and let's have a chat about our poll results.
So let me pull this up. Sometimes it takes a minute to load, but what we'll actually do, whether people are listening now or maybe listening later to this event on demand, let me just take a minute to read in the question we asked as well as the responses we received. So what we asked was, how do you decide which suppliers or third parties are the greatest source of risk? And the options that we gave are formal risk management program. That got 59% of the responses. The suppliers or third parties have already missed expectations with 30%. News headlines and relevant alerts with 8%. And professional instinct got just 3%. So Jag, let me start with you. When you look at these results, what is your general thought? Does this align with what you would expect to see? Are there any surprises here?
No major surprises, because in the business of helping firms create those formal risk management programs. However, obviously, I'd like to see that much beyond 59%. It's not just a desire of mine or companies, but it's also usually a compliance and regulatory requirement. Not having a really tight formal risk management program can open up the company to not just multiple risks, but regulatory issues, compliance issues, and also reputation impact, right? Not to mention the InfoSec privacy and all the other devastating impacts that company can have. So I think the main way by which companies can really get a handle on maintaining the surface area, the huge surface area, the third-party risk subjects a company to, is through formal risk management programs. I'm really happy to see professional instinct is 3%. I think my sort of personal goal is that while it is low today, that becomes a higher percentage and a bigger factor once you have the formal risk management programs in place. So I think a combination of the two is what I'd like to see, move up.
Now, that's really interesting that that's your take on the 3%. I would have actually expected that 3% would end up being bigger than it should be.
Right.
So, Phil, let me ask you about this, because whether you think that 3% should be higher or whether it should be 0, I'm curious about your thoughts on that number and whether you think it's connected in any way to some of the conversations we've had over time about whether category expertise should reside inside the company or come from external experts.
Well, I think I would say that just on that 59% for formal risk management program, I'm actually pleasantly surprised that the number was that high.
Yeah, I was too.
There are obviously there's a number of different ways you can define what a formal risk management program looks like. And there's a scale on what formality really looks like. That 3% professional instinct, I'm happy again that that's a low number. I think that one of the things that are sometimes that we see missing from formal risk management programs that suggest that this may be where professional instinct comes in is not just supplier risk, but it's the risk associated with what you're actually buying. I think that's harder for organizations to build structure around. It's probably easier to build structure and frameworks around which of my suppliers are high risk, just when you're looking at supplier by supplier basis. But when you think about the inherent risk of a product or service that you're buying, that's something that's a little bit missed. And that may be where some of the professional instinct comes in.
Yeah. Now, Jag, we've talked about the 59 and we've talked about the 3, but I'm particularly interested in this 30% that prioritize areas of risk to monitor because something bad has already happened. Any guesses that you would either have about that group or maybe advice that you would offer to them if they're sort of somewhat being reactionary today about their third-party risk management program?
Right. So I think the way, I mean, that's what you want to mitigate, right? You want to mitigate any missed expectations. So the way I see our best-in-class clients handle that is putting together supplier performance management programs in place from the beginning of the relationship. So if those are in place, like really tight, really well, then the expectation is set for the supplier, but also your early warning signs are in place to sort of avoid missed expectations. So supplier performance management, if you can couple that with some sort of feedback or subjective feedback from the category manager or the buyer as well, I think you can be in a really good place to avoid a majority of the surprises.
Yeah. Now, as we transition into the rest of the conversation that we're going to have today, Jag, I want to get your perspective on maybe companies that are newer in the risk management journey, at least formally speaking. There are always more areas that procurement wants to cover than we have time to address. Where do you suggest that procurement start when they're trying to figure out what their current greatest sources of exposure are?
Yeah, I mean any risk management program has to start with a relative prioritization or a prioritization of the biggest risk areas, right? Now, there's some things that'll be well recognized and well understood, and they've got to be a part of most organizations already, which would be like absolute basics like risk and compliance, right? Sorry, information security and privacy, right? In moving beyond that, I think the companies, based on their business, will need to understand what regulatory requirements they're subject to, and then just have a program in place to move through all the regulatory requirements. That it's a legal requirement; you have to do that, right? And then finally, they will need to. ESG is not a nice to have anymore. Like, it's an absolute must have. I mean, because all organizations, not just because all organizations are on a path to net zero, but also because all organizations, are now subject to various laws, and like the California law, in terms of ESG, the SEC law, the European CSRD. So most of the large organizations are subject to those laws. So you have to, sort of bring ESG into the into the conversation as well. So it would have to start with a relative prioritization of your risks, and then a path and a roadmap on how you're going to cover them. Ideally, in terms of technology, you want to choose a technology that can grow across multiple areas of risk, compliance, and ESG.
Yeah. Now, Phil, when we think about prioritizing sources or types of risk, any place where regulations apply is sort of going to pop right to the front of the line. And you have firsthand experience building these programs. When you think about the role that regulations and oversight bodies have on how you establish a program, how do you take a look at the specific regulation that you're trying to satisfy and then your own internal program to make sure you're building it out to meet that requirement?
Yeah, that's a great question. For context, I was involved in the building of a third-party risk management program where the Federal Reserve were actually in our building watching us do it. We had taken, this was back in 2008, was the first time I got involved in this. We'd taken TARP funds from the government. So I joined an organization that basically was struggling. They needed a bailout from the US government. Fortunately, just as I was joining, so I can put my hands up and say that it wasn't because of anything that I did. But we had no risk profile, really no risk consideration whatsoever when it came to suppliers. And all of a sudden, we've been granted bank holding company status, and so therefore I had to align with all the regulatory requirements in the US. So I think that it opened my eyes to third-party risk management. One, in the way that actually the regulatory requirements. So we had to cover and follow regulatory requirements from a number of different bodies, but here in the US, like the FFIEC and the OCC. And I actually, anyone who's not in a regulated industry, I actually recommend they go and read those frameworks, because they provide really, really good advice in terms of how to think about all the different elements of third-party risk that you should be considering. It's not just, is my supplier going to go bankrupt? Which I think historically is probably the area that the procurement focused on more than anything. But there's so many different things to think about and different factors. So I think that's really important. Anyone listening today who hasn't checked out those regulations, I would really encourage you to go and read those. Now, the risk is you have those regulations and you can go too far. So the pendulum can swing to the point where you're putting in so many different checks, balances, and controls in your processes that it means that you're essentially paralyzing the organization from going and doing anything. And that's when it gets to be a challenge, because you go from everybody going and doing what they wanted, within some kind of guardrails, to you're stopping the business from actually doing business. And honestly, the first time we did that, that's where we found ourselves. Probably because we're afraid of the Fed watching us, on the same floor of our building. But it's really about how can I take the intention of the regulatory requirements and make sure that, should I be audited if you have regulatory oversight, that you are complying with the intention of those regulations without having it drive you to create an environment where your business can't operate. One of the interesting things about the regulatory requirements is they require that the C-suite essentially of the business is on the hook, as if you are performing those products or services internally the same as externally. And that can, garner a lot of attention from a management perspective. But it is really important not to go too far, because that can have a counter effect as well.
Now, one of the other things, and I'm pretty sure this is an official requirement in 2024, anytime we have a challenge or a problem, we have to put it next to AI and see if AI is potentially the solution. So, Jag, when we think about, making decisions about where to prioritize, or taking a decent but contained risk management program and trying to help it scale, is this an area of procurement responsibility where we should be bringing AI in as part of the solution?
Yeah, as Philip was stating, this challenge of balancing, all the controls that you need, but not, if you will, completely slowing down your business. My thought immediately went to AI. Automation is usually the answer for this, but I would argue, Kelly, that it's impossible to manage all the compliance needs, all the different myriad of risks, and all the ESG needs without a great sort of focus on AI. So let me give you a few examples of how AI can help, right, in sort of managing third-party risk. The first and the most obvious one is in filling out these, onerous supplier questionnaires, which are one of the biggest points of friction in the process, right? So, using AI, if the supplier has already answered a questionnaire once, then they can just upload those answers. And with generative AI, it would draft all the answers for the questionnaire pretty quickly, instantly, and very accurately. So this is just one example. The other area is as new regulation comes up and you want to make changes to your program, not just new regulation, but also there could be an internal requirement, there could be an internal, optimization that you're trying to do to your program. Again, making changes to the program doesn't need to be a months-long, effort with a whole bunch of consultants, etc. Making changes to workflow and forms should be as simple as describing them. And again, generative AI can significantly help make your programs more agile, sort of enable you to make changes easily. And finally, the main way by which companies manage at scale is through reporting, right? And through insights. And with insights, gone are the days where you needed to ask an analyst to send a report and, they'll send you a report after like a week or two.
Yeah.
It's just, that's just, now, as long as the information is available, AI can mine it instantly and give you all the insights that you're looking for, all the risks and all the actionable things that you need, all instantly. So I actually argue that without AI, managing best-in-class risk and compliance program, third-party risk and compliance program, is actually going to be impossible.
Now, one of the interesting things, and I actually think this connects AI and ESG, two of the things that we've talked about so far, is that they can either be the answer to risk concerns, or if they're not managed well, they can actually be the source of risk on their own. If we think about ESG, not just as an initiative that companies view it as being in their best interest for many reasons to invest in, but potentially being a source of risk if it's managed wrong, how should companies be thinking about maybe outward looking or visionary statements around ESG and the liability that then creates not only for the company to take action, but for procurement to prove that that has done? How do you think about sort of making sure that ESG is a risk resolution type of initiative versus being a source of risk because it's being approached haphazardly or without enough formality?
Yeah, Kelly, the biggest risk with ESG is inaccurate reporting, which could be interpreted as greenwashing, right? So you're trying to claim more than you're actually doing. And then, I've actually talked to multiple clients who've had, either internal or external complaints about greenwashing, and it's led to a pretty significant amount of disruption within the firm. And I don't know if you've seen. I mean, some of this, if it was actually misrepresentation of ESG risks, some of these laws, actually carry criminal liability, not just civil liability. So this is like serious stuff. Now, the biggest source of inaccurate data typically is data that you're getting from suppliers, right? So I'm seeing companies on a spectrum of whether you're just approximating, your scope 3 emissions, which is emissions from your supply chain. You're completely approximating it using, some industry averages, and that's fine, except that it's really hard to show year-on-year improvements, especially if you have programs in place to improve your carbon emissions. So, what we're seeing best-in-class companies do in terms of ESG is gather primary data, primary greenhouse gas emissions from their top 500 to 1,000 suppliers. So using the 80-20 principle, your top 20% of suppliers are going to have, 80% of your GHG. And that I found is the, sort of the most practical way to get accurate data and still stay safe, from all the greenwashing allegations. And again, Kelly, like exactly the way you said, it is a pretty labor intensive task to gather sort of activity based or spend based greenhouse gas emissions from your third parties. And again, the only way I know how to help is AI. It can significantly help automatically create this data and get you the data in the format that you might want to report on. And then also you can put some checks in place to at least make sure that the data is reasonably accurate.
Now, do you generally see companies start down the road of investing in a third-party risk management program and then recognize ESG as an area where they need more investment, more resources? Or do you see it going the reverse way, where companies go down that road towards ESG, recognize the risks associated with trying to put the program in place, and that leads them back towards broader third-party risk? Is there a general or common path that you've seen companies follow?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, most third-party risk management suites available today don't do ESG well. So they do ESG on a surface level. So what I find companies doing is going out to the market looking for ESG specific solutions. Now, the ESG specific solutions, the existing solutions, are mainly designed for scope 1 and 2. So the scope 3 is kind of like early days for that. Scope 3 emissions is where 2/3 of a company's carbon emissions lie. It's 2/3 of the impact of Scope 3. So, it is a very active area. Just to answer your question, what we're seeing companies do is if they're using more of a generation one third-party risk management tool, they will look externally for a ESG solution and try to sort of just meet their needs, because the SEC is coming down, the California regulations are active, European CSRD regulations are active. So companies need to do something. If they have a sort of a modern comprehensive risk management program in place, then of course it's much easier for those companies, because then they can just extend this they can open up gathering data from their top 500 to 1,000 suppliers pretty quickly.
Yeah. Now, Phil, one of the things I think that's challenging about this is we can think about, okay, I have my ESG program and I have my risk appetite or my risk standards, but to think about ESG as one thing sort of conceals a lot of the complexity. Covers a lot of different kinds of projects, especially when you think about it from an execution standpoint, which is where the level that procurement's working on it at. Within ESG, should companies not just be segmenting initiatives, but also types of risk? So you might have an ESG initiative that's voluntary, that's viewed as good for brand reputation or customer retention, versus maybe going back to a little bit more of the regulatory side of things, places where, as Jag said, you may end up in prison if you've done this wrong, because there's an absolute red line that must not be crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of it as being there's three different areas of risk types, not necessarily types of risk within those areas, but you talked about regulatory requirements. So those are the absolute, you have to do those. There is the reputational risk, which is, that gap, for example, between your vision statement as an organization of what you're going to do in the ESG space and what the reality is that you're doing, or not having the right oversight or whatever it may be to stop things happening that then ultimately end up damaging your reputation. But the third one that we don't talk as much about is actually operational risk. And so what I mean by that is, what are you buying? What are the products and services that you're buying that actually, if there were constraints that are driven by ESG factors, shouldn't that be taken into account when you're thinking about your supply strategies? So that could be, something where you're buying something of finite resource, where you are buying something and it's all the providers are in one part of the world, which is subject to some very specific ESG requirements or challenges, or even bringing into this kind of discussions around modern slavery. So I think about, yes, reputation is obviously one part, of regulatory is the other, but the products that you buy and how can they be impacted? Because those are usually at least industry specific problems. They're not just individual supplier problems, and potentially even broader than that.
Yeah. Now, let's start to think a little bit about the doing when it comes to third-party risk management. Jag, a lot of times I hear people say, like, well, in this organization, everyone owns risk. And it always gives me this horrible feeling that saying everyone owns risk actually means the same thing as no one owns risk, that there ultimately has to be some amount of true ownership and accountability. It's going to vary, I'm sure, by company and industry. But generally speaking, do you think procurement is in the right place and with sort of the same aligned objectives to be a good place for final responsibility around third-party risk management to sit?
I think procurement is responsible for quarterbacking and coordinating risk management across multiple functions. So, for example, ensuring that a high risk if you're sharing data, then ensuring that you're getting sign off from InfoSec, and if you're sharing PII, you're getting sign off from privacy, and again, the same for ESG, the same for compliance, et cetera, right? So I think it's the procurement sits as the coordinator and the collector of all this information and all these sign offs from various parties. The ultimate responsibility of mitigating these specific risk areas like compliance areas, ESG, etc., they lie with the functional experts in that area. The procurement obviously can't own that, but the coordination Absolutely. There's no other organization that I can see that has more of a responsibility to own the, like, if you will, the orchestration across all these functional groups than procurement.
Now, Phil, I like the fact that Jag talked about quarterbacking and coordination. And so even if procurement doesn't have ultimate final ownership, because in most cases we're not making the decision about which supplier gets the contract, we still have to sort of reflect that responsibility in our expertise, in our org structure, in our processes. When we think about procurement's operating model, if we're going to emphasize risk as a business priority, what are maybe some process or talent or skills changes that procurement should be able to make, just to make sure that although there is some level of distributed ownership and accountability, procurement is prepared to step up and be in that quarterback role that the business needs them to occupy?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think that even though, and I completely agree with Jack, that the business stakeholders, ultimately the budget holders, the ones that are truly accountable for mitigating the risks of the products and services they buy, what procurement professionals have the opportunity to do is provide optionality to the stakeholders. Like, provide, these are the different ways that these are risks that we perceive based on all these different information and insights that we've got from all the different areas of the business, running through a formal third-party management program. Based on that, these are mitigations. These may be contractual mitigations. It may be, we recommend you go to a dual source. We recommend that you buy, if it's some product from this area of the world and some product from this other area of the world, even if it's the same supplier. I think that sometimes something that business stakeholders and procurement miss is they look, and when you talked to Jag about, risk is everyone's responsibility, I think that risk is easier to see when it's physical product and harder to see when it's services, but risk exists in services as well. So from a procurement perspective, it's really important for us to also be, educating the organization on risks that exist that are in a service and not just a product environment, and why they should take that seriously. So I think that understanding mitigation and kind of the strategy is a big part of it. Selling to the stakeholders why risk is important. That's a challenge that I had all the time, was why should you even care about this? Why should you invest more money in a dual sourcing strategy, for example? And I think some of the events of the last few years help to show what the risk is of not having that optionality. But risk is a really funny thing that people tend to forget about it when they haven't had a risk event for the last year or so. And people only remember then when something happens. And at that point, it's too late to do anything about it because they're back into reactive mode. So those are really the areas that I see that procurement can play a role. It's kind of, as Jack said, the quarterbacking, it's influencing, it's kind of selling the story of why risk is important to focus on. It's helping the businesses recognize that they've got options and kind of selling what those options are inside of the business.
Well, and it's interesting too, and I actually see there's a question that's come in from Craig about where sort of at the C-suite level risk exists. Phil, that's almost to your point about, is the risk, are you making a physical product, your company? Is it services? Based on what your company does, is it InfoSec risk? Is it potentially some sort of financial risk? When we think about that executive level, that is something procurement needs to be focused on.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is it goes back to a comment I made kind of towards the beginning when I said the early days of risk management from a procurement perspective were, what's the D&B, the Dun & Bradstreet score for my supplier, and are they likely to go bankrupt? And, you kind of take that D&B score, and if it's, if it looks good, then you're happy, there's no risk that exists. And if it doesn't look good, then you don't really know what to do about it anyway, so it goes on a list. I feel like the same from an info security perspective. That is one risk, and that's a very important risk, and it's a growing risk, but it's not the only risk. So what's most important about a third-party risk management program is you're taking kind of the whole 360 view of all the different risks that are present. And some of those risks might be minor based on the inherent risk with the product or service that you're buying. A good part of these programs will look, and you'll kind of go down your taxonomy and say, what are all the things that we buy, and assign kind of a risk rating or risk scoring to those, where one thing's not important, but actually, the internal gardener who's coming and watering the plants in your office, is actually very important because they can see everybody's desk, and that's a big infosec risk. So you kind of take that bigger picture of all the different risks that exist rather than just focusing on one.
Yeah. Now, Jag, go ahead. I was going to pull you in, but did you want to add something to what Phil said?
What the other thing that I'm seeing just in the best in class programs is focus beyond the risk of the supplier, but focus on the risk of the product or the service. So, for example, the same supplier could offer something that is low risk, but then, the second project, if you will, once you approve the supplier, the second project could be something that, has huge like privacy implications or, security implications or compliance implications, right? So, what I'm seeing is a move away from simply focusing on due diligence on the supplier towards, sort of including, due diligence on the specific service or the product that we're offering.
And it is interesting as we start to think about suppliers, because even the types of risk that may be associated with a supplier require very different actions from procurement. There can be a supplier, to Phil's point, that's at risk of going bankrupt or may suddenly be acquired by a competitor and you can no longer access them. But there may also be risk in their supply chain that they have no control over, no ability to ward off. Given that it may or may not be within that supplier's control, the level of risk they introduce to the company, what sorts of conversations should procurement be having with those suppliers about risk? And then how should that be validated by pulling in different types of information sources, so we're not just banking on trust, given, it is important, but it can't be the only source of decision making?
Yeah, I think, the tier 2 supplier risk is, one of the risks that companies are most blind to, right? Yeah. Probably, with the highest risk areas. Yeah. So tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. What I see companies doing is at least asking for the core suppliers that our suppliers using, so the sub suppliers that the suppliers using to meet this product or service, and actually sort of having a comprehensive critical view, comprehensive view of the critical suppliers, critical sub suppliers, is what I mean. Now, this data is really hard to get. So a lot of our clients rely on self-attestation by the suppliers on their tier 2 risk. Where that is completely insufficient is in compliance. So, for example, there are all these sort of human rights and supply chain, like modern slavery laws, and those apply to tier 2 suppliers just as much as tier 1 suppliers. So for those, there are specific data sources which companies must use to understand, at least at a minimum, the compliance risk, the modern slavery risk, and some of the sanctions risk, right? If you're sourcing things from a prohibited country or a prohibited region, or in a way that's not legal, that is not something that companies would be able to get out of. I'd love to offer additional data sources in terms of tier 2 risks, but those are really hard to come.
Yeah, I feel like that's been one of the biggest challenges for years as tier 2 and tier 3 risk, and actually understanding where those risks exist. It's very collaborative, as Jag said. It's self-attestation. It's doing workshops with your key suppliers so that you can map out the supply chains, where they are willing and able to do so. Oftentimes they say, well, this is my IP and I'm not telling you what my supply chain looks like. Yeah. I think from a category perspective, what is smart is, and this isn't necessarily data driven, but this is being curious about your category and all the drivers that go through your category, is where is the risk that spreads across the entire supply chain? Because what you'll often find in a tier 2 or even tier 3 level, maybe even tier 4, but there's one single point of failure somewhere in that supply chain, or one city that is a point of failure in that supply chain, where something goes wrong, and it's not just your supplier that's impacted, it's all suppliers that's impacted. And that's where that's the worst, because you can't then go and say, well, I've got two suppliers, and so I'm going to go to the second one, because they're all impacted by the same problem. So I think it is really, that we have a responsibility in a category management kind of framework to understand what some of those potential points of failure are.
Yeah.
Just in terms of, Kelly, if I can just add one more
Of
thing
course.
that I'm noticing across clients, is beyond some of the risks that we've talked about. An emerging area of risk is it's just like security or national defense related to risks. So what I see companies doing is identifying sort of those weak links, or areas where some regions where there could be national defense risk, and trying to sort of move away from that actively. And it's very obviously, if you're a defense contractor or a government contractor, it's absolutely imperative and critical. But I see companies even outside of those industries start to focus on this new area of risk, which is more defense and national security related.
Yeah. No, and one of the other things that I think is interesting, and there's a question from Nora that's come in that I actually think brings up something really interesting. We talked about ESG earlier, and I think procurement at times has been frustrated around trying to make progress there. And in some ways, we've learned that the best way to actually move the ball on any ESG program is not to manage it as a separate initiative, but to fully integrate it within processes, decision-making frameworks, any of those things that we're regularly doing, so that it becomes incorporated as just one more part of the procurement program. Should we be looking for ways, and Jag, maybe I'll ask you this first, and Phil, I'll see if you have anything to add. Should we be looking to embed risk mindset, risk awareness, risk information within existing procurement systems and processes, so that it doesn't become a separate parallel activity, but rather it's something that is so ingrained in procurement's objectives and priorities that it sort of permeates the entire process, whether it's a sourcing project, whether it's supplier evaluations, whether it's investigating a new way to meet a business need? How can we make sure that that's as folded in as it needs to be at all times?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be embedded into the procurement team's process, right? Because best-in-class companies are evaluating not just if the supplier is not at the time of onboarding, but also at the time of a new contract, right? Yeah. So every new contract goes through a risk mitigation, risk analysis, etc. Now that has to be tied into the sourcing function. Unfortunately, the P2P and the S2P tools aren't best at mitigating the full spectrum of compliance risk and the ESG needs and all these other areas, right? So what I see companies doing is having a trigger to initiate the risk mitigation, which ties into their sourcing tools and P2P tools. Yeah. But then the actual risk mitigation and monitoring and all the reporting actually happens in that TPRM tool, just because the TPRM function just seems to be fairly nuanced, and it's hard to fit it into the S2P and P2P tools. I just haven't seen that done very effectively. But it is the trigger that triggers off a investigation, and then the approval comes back into the S2P or the P2P system.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, sorry, Kelly. And I think there's basically 2 points of entry for TPRM. It's a new SOW, or so should I say, there's a new piece of work that's added to an existing supplier, or there's you renegotiate a contract or whatever it is on an annual or 3-year basis, and you may not have touched it from a TPRM program again. That's the opportunity to start looking at from that lens. But then every time it renews, and then the other time is the point of intake. So what's interesting as you think about process is how as we're getting more focused on the intake process, and everything that an organization buys funneling through consistent channels, that's the point as well, where you look and say, okay, again, going back to the conversation we had about the risk of the product or service that you buy, that's where you can kind of trigger what is it we're buying and how risky is that. So then what do we do about that as we go through the due diligence, the sourcing process, the contracting process, and all those. Now, from my perspective, every time you're buying something, whether it's renewing a contract, whether it's something new, the question should be in your mind, what is the risk associated with this purchase? What are the risks associated with that purchase? Because if you're not thinking that, then you're going to end up signing yourself up for something that probably is subjecting you to a lot more risk than it needs to be, because it's at that time of contracting where you can mitigate most of the risk.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because we talk about differentiated decision making, right? Which is one of procurement's things we're trying to enable. But if we're not thinking, if we're not stopping and thinking, what kind of risk might this expose me to? I mean, just like you can't follow a 6 or 7 or 8 step strategic sourcing process like a checklist and have it result in a strategic outcome, we do need to be trying to step back and take a look at these situations and think, what additional information should we bring to bear? What else do we need to research? What do we need to put in front of the business? And it creates both a challenge, but also an opportunity for procurement to be that critical point of at least enlightenment around potential risk.
Well, it's funny, when you think about a lot of times when we have built procurement policies and procedures in the past, we have looked at, should procurement be involved based on a spend threshold? So that spend threshold can be different based on the scale and the size of an organization. But let's just say, well, anything under 50,000, I don't really care about, the stakeholder can do on their own. Anything that's 50 to 500, we're going to get 3 bids. Anything that's over $500,000 is going to be bought strategically. But that spend is the only lens that we take to think about what should we do with this and what due diligence. But so many of the highest risk products and services will fit in that under $50,000 kind of category. And you may have the biggest contract you have in your organization, but there isn't a great deal of risk associated with it. Yeah. But you're putting all your attention on that. So that's where I go back to that. It's not a spend. It's what's the risk associated with it? And then you can layer on spend afterwards. But if it's high inherent risk, then it doesn't matter if it's $1,000 purchase. You need to be doing due diligence on that.
Yeah. And to that point, Jag, let me pull you in for sort of final thoughts here as we approach time. Phil talked about looking at all of procurement's work through a risk lens, not spend first and then potential risk, but simply looking at it operationally through a risk lens. What advice do you have for keeping that right front and center in procurement's mind as they're approaching any kind of effort, not just at those traditional triggers where we say, oh, let's go check supplier financial risk, but all the time in our work? How do we make sure that that's front and center?
I think a third-party program supported by a modern third-party management tool can actually give that to clients. So just talking more tactically, and completely agree with Phil on that. As companies try to procure something, many of the risks can become extremely transparent in some of those programs. So, for example, what data are we sharing? Where is the supplier? Where does the service need to be located? In terms of which region? What are the transparency risks and all that, right? And many of these can just be almost auto-calculated, if you will, in many of the third-party management programs. And then the only way to scale them up is through what could be like auto triggers, like automated triggers for additional risk verification, etc. So it is it's basically a way. The best way I've seen it is if the third-party management program can support the auto calculation of risk, the auto multiple data sources to figuring out these risks automatically, and then creating a sort of composite score, so you can trigger additional reviews based on not just individual risk areas, but also the composite risk area, which is typically a weighted average of the risks that are inherent in that sort of supplier relationship.
Yeah.
And if I could just add, you don't need to ask a ton of questions. I think that's where sometimes companies get hung up on building a TPRM program, is they think, I know this is the mistake we made when we first did it, was you asking so many questions to determine what the risk is. You don't need to ask that many. It can be 6, 7 questions, maybe just simple questions. It's check boxes. That can pretty easily give you a score to understand whether I need to do something or not. It doesn't have to be something that's really too onerous. And as Jack said, now that you're starting to look at AI and being able to answer some of those questions for you, it makes it even easier. So this isn't something that's going to add layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy on top of, all the work that you've already got to do.
Absolutely. Jack, were you going to add something?
If it's elegantly architected, a lot of the risk can actually be understood and sourced from third-party data sources and AI.
Yeah.
So you don't have to ask, in sort of the old way, you would ask a ton of questions.
You'd ask 50 questions and figure out what's on the 50 questions.
But in the new way, you're basically asking just a few questions and then getting the rest of the information automatically through third-party data sources and through AI.
Absolutely. Well, I think with that, Jag and Phil, I want to thank you both for sharing your time and your insights. This was a really interesting conversation. Covered a lot of ground in just under an hour on the topic of risk, which is something that's never going to go out of style. I also want to thank everyone who's joined us live, who put in questions, everybody who will be listening or watching later on demand. I appreciate you spending some time with us. I'd like to thank everybody for being here, for participating in the community. And of course, I hope you have a great and low risk rest of your day.